1 second here. Welcome to the Pipeline Online Podcast. In this episode, we have Dr. Chris Keefer. He's a Toronto physician who has been a leading advocate for expanding nuclear power in Canada. Ontario is in the starting phase of a massive nuclear expansion, and Saskatchewan is just getting going. Saskatchewan is looking to Ontario for its experience, and Dr. Keefer is a good guy to ask about that. Hello, folks. Got myself, Brian Zinchuk, and Bronwyn Eyre.
Hey, Brian.
And today we've got a guy we want to talk to for many months now, Dr. Chris Keefer from Ontario. And Chris, can you introduce yourself here and what exactly you're doing talking about nuclear, being that you're a doctor, and I don't think that means a physicist?
You're exactly right, Brian. First off, thank you so much for and Bronwyn for having me on the show. I've been a big fan of the Pipeline podcast. So yes, I am an emergency physician. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a doctor in the nuclear medicine field or radiation oncology field. And I am also the president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy, which is a nonprofit that's been around for about 5 years. Our crowning accomplishment was leading a very lonely, what seemed like a hopeless battle to refurbish one of the large nuclear stations in Ontario, which we ultimately won. And I'm also the host and senior editor of Decouple Media, which is mostly a podcast. We also do some long form video content, and we've been going for about 5 years on that as well. So real pleasure to be here, Brian and Bronwyn. Thanks for having me.
So how does a physician become so integrally involved in the nuclear discussion?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, physicians are well known for being pretty busy people, right? I am an emergency physician, and that is known as the hobbyist specialty because we go really hard when we're at work. But we do have a little bit of bizarre time off. Usually we're working evenings and holidays. And so when it's 9 to 5 and our loved ones are at work, we're sitting around and we're busy adrenaline junkie kind of people. And we take on different sort of hobbies and habits. And so, you know, I've had a long history in advocacy, more in the medicine field, to be honest. I started Canada's first clinic for seasonal agricultural workers in Southern Ontario, for instance. But, you know, when my son was born in 2018, I started thinking a lot about issues that his generation will face and thinking a little further into the future. Climate change definitely came across the radar in that sort of scanning for sort of problems that might affect his generation. And I started thinking seriously about climate change. I have to say I became an intolerable doomer. My ex-wife at the time said, just shut up and do something about it. She meant sort the recycling better, take out the compost more diligently. And being who I am, being, you know, empirically driven, I started looking around at what the solutions were. And right here in my own backyard in Ontario, we have a deeply decarbonized grid. We were able to accomplish a clean energy for coal swap with a large coal phase out here in Ontario. And there's a lot more to the story. I mean, we produce medical isotopes which sterilize 40% of the world's single-use medical devices, things I use every day in the emergency department, you know, syringes, IV tubing, dialysis catheters, all those sorts of things. So it just became a really interesting field. And it's, you know, I'm pretty ADHD, but it's really sustained my interest now for a good 7 years. And I'm not showing any signs of slowing down on it. So if that makes any sense to you, Bronwyn, feel free to ask me follow-up questions, but that's this long tenuous path into, you know, real devotion to nuclear energy advocacy.
That's interesting. Well, so I guess when we talk about the nuclear theme issue at the moment, small modular reactors are top of mind, clearly. And I guess remind us from your perspective, coming at it with the passion that you have and the interest that you have shown over the last few years, remind us, I guess, how the small modular reactor conversation or movement got started from your perspective and why.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so this is a really quite a fascinating story because, you know, I would say if there is an iron law in nuclear energy, it really is one of economies of scale. You have a number of what we call not fixed costs, but inherent costs of nuclear energy. And these include things like licensing, like regulation, like shielding, like fuel costs, like spent fuel management or nuclear waste storage, et cetera. And these have always been significant costs, but because of producing large amounts of power in centralized facilities, we're able to amortize those costs nicely over a big chunk of generation. And so what we've seen seen around the world is nuclear energy has started, as it did in Canada, in prototype reactors like the nuclear power demonstration reactor, about 20 megawatts. It's scaled up to about 200 megawatts, 500. We're up to about 900, and now we're working on a gigawatt scale CANDU reactor. And so around the world, we've seen the exact same pattern. If your grid can take it, in terms of N+1 criteria and single largest contingency, if your grid can handle it, you want to move towards that gigawatt size. There are reactors that have probably gotten a little too big. The Europeans are building this 1600 megawatt monster called the EPR, but that sweet spot seems to be around a gigawatt again, if your grid can take it. So something interesting happened in the 2010s, 2015s. In the West, nuclear energy really was in a pretty big crisis at that point. We'd suffered the Fukushima accident in Japan. We discovered this incredible hydraulic fracturing technique, which all of a sudden freed this enormous bounty of hydrocarbons in the Great Shale basins across North America. Natural gas became cheaper than drinking water. It's a very fascinating time period, right? I mean, the U.S. there's some entrepreneurs that were looking at building LNG import facilities around 2010. And of course, those quickly turned into export facilities. So we just saw this massive change in the use case for nuclear power really slipping away. Demand, we had the global economic crisis, demand growth was really plateauing. And so if you're going to build nuclear, if you're going to build a gigawatt of nuclear power, you want to make sure that there are customers for those kilowatt hours. And if that's not assured, then it's a bit of a gamble putting a big gigawatt chunk of power on the grid. And so the industry, to try and survive and have something to do, said, hey, maybe we could go and build these small reactors. Now, they're not, we know about economies of scale. These are very real. But if we say modular, maybe we can find a way to make these things buildable. Maybe we can build them even faster and more economically than large reactors. And ultimately, in nuclear, there's a lot of optimism when you first propose a reactor design. Is the famous paper reactor concept, right?
But yeah, I've seen some stuff on that.
The closer you get to reality, it's a bit of a death by a thousand cuts. Costs start coming back, and we'll probably talk about it in a couple minutes here. But as we've moved towards actually beginning construction on the Western world's first grid scale SMR, we're seeing the costs are higher even than large scale nuclear energy. So the SMR thing, the trade associations, I think, got a little, drank a little too much of their own Kool-Aid. And I think, unfortunately, it's become such a captivating idea in the general public and amongst policymakers that it's going to take some real, I think, education to sort of come to a more balanced, nuanced, fact-based approach to what is the best scale of nuclear energy.
You're on mute, Brian.
Sorry, I turn it off when I'm drinking my coffee, so now you're hearing me slurp. I want to get into that because Saskatchewan is very serious about getting into nuclear power. Governments over the past 20 years kind of hummed and hawed about it. We looked at a CANDU reactor over 20 years ago, and that didn't happen. And then, part of it is because the Saskatchewan grid on a typical day is between 2,700 and 3,600 megawatts. So when you're talking 1,000 megawatt scale or 900 or 600, that's a little bit big. Our biggest generators right now are 370 megawatts.
Yeah.
So reality is that, a big one just didn't make sense. But now we're looking at, everyone's talking in every jurisdiction about the possibility of requiring double the power generation capacity of what we have today. And you got everyone from presidents to premiers talking about it. So the idea of maybe we do need some big reactors has come up. So in 2022, Saskatchewan's then minister and cabinet colleague of Bronwyn's here, Don Morgan, announced that Saskatchewan's selected the General Electric Hitachi BWRX 300, which I'm going to show on screen here, as its chosen design for our first small modular reactor. And at the time, Morgan spoke of building 4 such reactors. And since that time, the number has been very fluid, anywhere from, we won't build just one, so it'll be at least 2 to up to 8 or 9. He mentioned before he was succeeded by 2 other ministers since then. So the number, it hasn't really solidified. In the past 2 years, what's happened though is that we had Westinghouse, which went into bankruptcy, building this sucker right here, the Vogel plant. And I want to get your thoughts on that in a minute. Westinghouse went into bankruptcy, and 2 Canadian firms bought it out. 51% went to Brookfield, which was at the time run by Mark Carney, Prime Minister now. And 49% was Cameco, which is based in Saskatoon. So all of a sudden, the possibility of building a reactor, which has some Saskatchewan ownership to it, became a real thing. A month ago, I videoed, and I haven't had a chance to release the video yet, a conversation between Premier Moe and the president of Westinghouse and of Cameco on stage at a conference in Saskatoon. The Premier is talking very heavily about the possibility of building large reactors like this. Now, this is an AP1000, which, so people understand, it's not 1,000 megawatts, it's actually 1,200 megawatts. So one of these is equal to 4 of these. And just before I throw it over to you here, what's really important about this is that when I attended the announcement 3 years ago that Saskatchewan was going to build up to 4 of these, the Ontario Power Generation Minister at the time, Todd Smith, said, well, it could be $2 to $3 billion each. And Saskatchewan's Morgan said, well, they could be 4 to 5. Yeah. The Ontario guy said, whoa, we don't think it's going to be that high. Well, in April, Ontario, and I think you were probably there. Were you there? They announced that they're going to build 4, commencing construction on 4 of these suckers, and the price was $20.9 billion, which is almost precisely equal to the Saskatchewan budget for 2025. So that's where we're at here. That kind of talks about how these things escalate in cost, and is it cheaper to build smaller or bigger? So can you talk first of all about Darlington New Nuclear, then we'll get into Bruce C.
Sure. Yeah. So, I have been invited to many nuclear energy announcements, notably the decision on the refurbishment of Pickering and the decision to build large nuclear reactors up at the Bruce. My relationship with the government's a little more testy now because I have been a critic of the decision around building SMRs at the Darlington B new nuclear site. And, the reason for that is kind of, there's a few reasons. One is that this is a site licensed for 4,800 megawatts. It has got a fully grandfathered environmental impact assessment. It is ready to build on. It is, probably the most precious nuclear generating site that we have in the country. It's very, very hard to get these sites permitted. The environmental impact assessment processes take a long time. Indigenous consent is a major issue, which the Bruce nuclear station is now struggling with as they plan large additions of, again, large units. So a big part of it was, we're wasting 4,800 licensed megawatts and only building a quarter of that capacity on site. But the other thing was, again, my skepticism about small reactors. As you were mentioning, Brian, the initial fanfare, the promises from GE Hitachi was that by kind of nth of a kind, we'd have these things down to maybe 1.3 billion Canadian per unit, which sounds great. I mean, if you can do that, let's build 8 or 9 of them. I was always skeptical of that. And I was actually very impressed with Don Morgan and using a realistic number like 5 billion. I think that shows a lot of maturity. And frankly, glad to see that coming out of Saskatchewan, because as you mentioned, I think there was a bit of magical thinking in Ontario on this topic. But yeah, all that to be said, I think that was a real moment of sticker shock, wasn't it? The first unit, 6.1 billion. And then, so the initial sort of investment decision they've made is they're going to build 1 unit and some shared infrastructure. The shared infrastructure is another 1.2 billion. So we're looking again at $7.3 billion really to get this first unit built. And then there's the hope that we're going to learn things through the construction process, improve the design, and by the 4th unit, we'll get down to about, I believe, 4.2 billion per unit. That's the not quite 10th of a kind, but we'll call it nth of a kind cost. And when I look to why we're doing this, the other big question that comes up is, why are we building an American reactor technology when Ontario has invested $26 billion in the country's largest infrastructure project, that's refurbishment of our Canada units, which will give them another 30 to 40 years of operation. We have, tooled up hundreds of factories and workplaces, trained up, tens of thousands of skilled tradespeople on this technology, literally doing an engine swap out. So every part of the nuclear steam supply system is being replaced at our plants. It's just this intimate knowledge we have of this sector. And because, we have a made in Canada, designed in Canada, operated in Canada reactor technology, we capture all of the value of these really massive investments that need to be made. And I think this is, a big point I like to make is nuclear is prone to a lot of category errors. And I think the best way to, comparing a natural gas plant to a nuclear plant, you're going to make a bunch of mistakes, right? Think of it really as being most akin to hydroelectricity, where you have a very, very large capital cost and a high risk construction project that then has a value proposition, which is intergenerational and ultimately produces very cheap, stable power and provides excellent jobs, again, for generations and generations. And so for that reason, I've been a big advocate of CANDU technology. If we deployed 4 large CANDU units at Darlington, or if we had, I think we would have got a lot more bang for our buck, built a Canadian product, and not exposed ourselves to, what's become a reality in the last year of this unprovoked trade war against us, the vulnerability of building a U.S. reactor technology, which is very highly controlled by export control laws within the U.S. So lots to unpack there. I'm sorry if I went on a bit of a diatribe there, Brian, and Bronwyn. But
why do you think we didn't do the CANDU? Why do you think that wasn't the route taken? Most honest answer.
Yeah, no, I think it's path dependency. I think it was a well-meaning decision. And in 2015, when we were emerging from the global economic crisis, demand was flat, as I mentioned before. So a large addition, if you had surplus baseload, that's expensive. You really don't want to design that into your system. So appropriately, I think they were looking at this SMR idea. I think there hadn't been quite enough critical thinking about it, but the decision was made to build SMRs at that point, and the price point looked okay based upon what the vendors were advertising. But facts on the ground changed quite rapidly, and especially recently with the data center revolution, with the big battery plant investments that were announced in Ontario, with just this general tendency as we enter into this deglobalizing world now, where we're saying, hey, we need to reshore some critical industry. We can't just have everything built for us in China. Let's move some of that back home. We're going to need more power, and so we've been seeing sort of skyrocketing power demand projections, and that really means we have a big grid in Ontario. We peak at 26 gigawatts. So building small units to meet a large increase in demand does not make sense in Ontario. I can see an argument for Saskatchewan, as you mentioned, what your sort of peak generation is there. But in Ontario, this just doesn't make sense. And again, the proof is in the pudding. Looking forward now, we're looking at the Wesleyville site. Our energy minister is talking about building up to 10 gigawatts of nuclear there. I think that's a little optimistic. The Bruce C site. This is Wesleyville, so it's another OPG site. Currently has a gas-fired unit on it that was built in 1973, right before the OPEC crisis, and never turned on. We have basically 2 nuclear sites with the potential to add 8 to 12 gigawatts of new nuclear. No one is saying we're going to be doing SMRs at those sites. So, the IESO as well, in terms of looking at the kilowatt and kilowatt hour costs, are saying, listen, SMRs are more expensive to build and operate. So in terms of the best modeling, we understand that just makes sense. So the question is, for Saskatchewan, will we pay a premium, to build a smaller unit, right? Or are we going to do a whole bunch of work to strengthen interties and make sure we have enough combustion turbines, et cetera, maybe some batteries to be able to deal with that N+1 criterion contingency event?
So let's talk a little bit about what's going on with Bruce C. I know you were present for the announcement there, and folks, every time I've seen an announcement come out of Ontario, we got Premier there. They usually have Chris standing pretty close to him. So, I mean, you've been part of this, and I think your advocacy has absolutely made a difference, as indicated by your presence. What's happening at Bruce C? Because right now, the Bruce nuclear power plant, my understanding, is the largest in the world at this point. Mm-hmm. And what are they planning on doing there?
Yeah, if I may, just for 1 second. I mean, the reason that I've been at a lot of these events is, up until now, civil society, basically, in the media, when there's a government announcement about nuclear, they'll talk to the minister and then they'll go to civil society. And that basically means the anti-nuclear environmental NGOs, right? And so a new industry independent nonprofit came into existence, Canadians for Nuclear Energy, that has a number of really, really intelligent advisors, and we've developed great policy documents. And so now the media comes to us and we get a more balanced position. And so I think that's part of why we've been invited to these events. Again, not so much recently because of some skepticism about SMRs, but getting back to that Bruce C announcement. So this is the potential to build 4,800 megawatts of new nuclear at the Bruce Power Station. So the Bruce Power Station is made up of Bruce A and Bruce B. Both of these have 4 large CANDU reactors, and the current site generating capacity is about 6,500 megawatts. through uprates in the refurbishment process, they're hoping to break 7,000 megawatts at that site, which does make it the largest operating nuclear plant in the world. There is one that is larger in Japan, but because of the post-Fukushima shutdowns, it is not operating. So Canada does have this incredible distinction, being a pretty small country, of having the largest nuclear power station in the world. And I think it's something we should be immensely proud of. Adding 4,800 megawatts, I mean, this thing just gets supersized. And it's an interesting choice. I mean, it's pretty far from a load center. It's about 2 or 3 hours away from major cities in the Southwest and Toronto itself. But it is a site that's you've got a lot of space. It's optimal in terms of being right next to a big cold lake. You have a community that knows nuclear and loves nuclear. The closer you're driving through the countryside to get to the Bruce Power Station, and half an hour away, the houses start getting a little nicer. The community centers are a bit bigger. 15 minutes away, there's just the kind of economic vitality that these stations bring and the support they generate, I think, is a big reason. Unfortunately, a lot of our siting decisions nowadays are so much based upon social license, which makes sense. But I think that's one of the reasons to make this station, which is a little far from load centers, even bigger, is because of just how supportive the community is.
So are we talking AP1000s? Are we talking Monarchs, which is the newest version, which has not been licensed, to my understanding, from CANDU? What are we talking for technology here?
So this is what I'll call an epochal decision. While you were mentioning that Westinghouse is now under 100% Canadian ownership, Cameco 49% stake, Brookfield Asset Management, or it might be Brookfield Renewable Partners. It's hard to keep up with all their subsidiaries, with a 51% stake. The question is this a Canadian company? Importantly, Brookfield relocated their offices to New York, which is kind of interesting. So they've gone south of the border. But more importantly, Westinghouse is a storied American corporation. Obviously started with the great inventor himself, George Westinghouse, designing the air brake, gas infrastructure, grid infrastructure.
AC power.
Teamed up with Tesla on AC power against Edison's DC power, transformers, just a titan of heavy industry in the U.S., headquartered in Pittsburgh, built the first pressurized water reactors in the United States for the Navy and later for the civilian grid, built, hundreds of nuclear reactors around the world. Truly impressive company. But eventually sold to the British Nuclear Fuels, bought it in 1998, sold then on to Toshiba in Japan in 2006, in these sort of bad post-Chernobyl years. Ultimately went bankrupt, as you said, in building Vogtle, and was acquired by Brookfield, and now Brookfield and Cameco together. So when the company was owned by British Nuclear Fuels, did its headquarters move to Britain? Was the engineering work happening in Britain? Was the IP licensed in Britain? No. When it was bought by Japan, was Westinghouse all of a sudden a Japanese company, headquartered in Tokyo, bringing all of those engineering jobs to Japan? No. And similarly, right now, Westinghouse very much remains an American company. The IP that they control, the AP1000, is a U.S. origin reactor technology, meaning you need to have consent from the U.S. government to export it abroad. It's very different than what we have here in Canada in the form of the CANDU reactor, which again was developed by Canadian scientists and engineers at Chalk River and at Sheridan Park, where we've done a lot of the design work on this reactor, where we own 100% of the IP, where we have exported the reactor around the world, where we are the global headquarters for maintaining that reactor fleet around the world, getting all of the value add, making our own fuel. Of course, we're able to use that beautiful Athabascan, Saskatchewan uranium. We don't need to enrich it. We just turn it into uranium dioxide, put it into a pretty simple fuel element. It gives us complete fuel security. So I'm probably giving away some reasons why I'm in the CANDU camp on this one. If we do both the GE Hitachi SMR as we are doing, and we do AP1000 instead of CANDU, we've really sort of, I think, let the Trojan horse in, and it's going to have major implications going forward for our own nuclear sector. We go from being a tier 1 nuclear nation to a branch planted, kind of like we are with auto, right? We have essentially one of the best, we'll say, cars in the world that we make all the parts for and manufacture here in Ontario, and it's a great car and everybody wants it. This would be the equivalent of saying, yeah, we're not going to build a Canadian car anymore. We're just going to have a branch plant and build for American brands. There's no need to do that.
We're just going to go to our first of 2 30-second breaks here for ads, and Bronwyn, you'll be up next. For your well servicing needs in southeast Saskatchewan and southwest Manitoba, you need the General. That's General Well Servicing of Cardiff, Saskatchewan. They've got a fleet of double, triple rigs, pressure vessels, and lighting rentals ready to serve you. They can perform rig assist and frac assist operations as well. Call Kevin at 306-482-3244. That's Call the General at 306-482-3244. Yes, sir. All right, drama.
Yeah, no, I've been processing everything you've been saying, and very interesting. I guess being a former politician, I always kind of go back to the colloquial, if we can, just a little bit in terms of maybe the explanation and putting it in some context. And I guess just to be completely clear, I think what you're saying is the based on the sort of the post-Fukushima and economic realities that have evolved over the last few years, I think you're saying that, first of all, on the SMR front, period, you don't think it's the best option for Ontario. That the larger model would make sense now, given all that we're seeing. And you mentioned data centers, and I was going to ask you about that and everything else that we're looking at. So I think it's fair to say that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in a minute. But if we are, then it should be more within the can-do context in Ontario. And in Saskatchewan, I'd like to get your thoughts on, I think that there is still a certain amount of confusion out there around why are we even going down this road? Why can't we just build a large traditional reactor? And I think you were saying that to a certain extent, it's been up until now anyway, a power, demand, and production issue. And that maybe there just isn't enough there in terms of off-cell, off the grid and otherwise to do that. But is there now? And so I guess, the Ontario context, if you wouldn't mind, first of all, kind of in relatively colloquial speak, if you could, sort of explaining or clarifying whether you think SMRs are still an option given what we've seen change in Ontario and then in Saskatchewan, and then I have a follow-up.
Sure. Yeah. So my answer in Ontario was it's unequivocally a bad idea. It's just less economic. Again, higher cost to build on a per installed kilowatt basis, and higher cost to operate. And this is just basic economies of scale. I think the question in Saskatchewan partly is a demand question. It sounds, I'm hearing whisperings that, and we hear it all over the place, that, demand is on the rise. We don't have a great investment environment in Canada right now for obvious reasons. We might be revising down some of those demand estimates here in Ontario as a result of the trade war that we're facing right now. But putting aside demand, I think the big question, again, is just grid contingency in Saskatchewan. If you are to build a larger unit, whether this interesting thing about a CANDU is we have the CANDU 6, which is about 700 megawatts. We have the Monarch, which is about a gigawatt CANDU, which is in design. It's based on a very mature. It's basically based on the large CANDU units we have at Darlington, with a few upgrades to stay up to code on things like seismic, which has changed a bit post Fukushima, et cetera. So it's not a radical first of a kind departure. But in any case, we have that 700 megawatt CANDU, we have a 1,000 megawatt CANDU, or we have, as Brian was saying, an 1,100 megawatt AP1000. If we're to build those large units in Saskatchewan, there's going to have to be big investments, strengthening interties with neighboring provinces. If you look to New Brunswick, where they do have a CANDU 6 there, it's about 660 megawatts. They have a very large oil-fired generator that's almost 1,000 megawatts. They have big interties with Quebec, with ISO New England. And so they've really designed their system, and they have a large coal unit at Belladuna, supercritical coal plant, I think 450 megawatts. So they've designed their system to be able to deal with Point Lepreau tripping offline. And so that's the big question, is it's going to take a lot of enabling investments to build that larger unit. So maybe this is an argument where you could say, well, okay, well, maybe we'll pay that price premium on a more expensive per kilowatt hour SMR, so we don't have to do all those great upgrades. And that's an argument to be made. I will say, it's interesting. I mean, everything is more expensive now, right? We're looking at natural gas turbines. Part of my rationale was, because another big reason we're building the SMRs in Ontario, we're told, as well, there's this massive export market, and Saskatchewan's going to go next, and Ontario can sell its expertise to Saskatchewan. And I was saying, I'm not confident they're going to do that for $6 billion a unit. And you really can't assume that once we get an nth of a kind cost down, if we get an nth of a kind cost down, that you're going to start at that reduced $4 billion cost. You're probably going to be back up at the $6 billion cost, at least for your first unit there. So I was saying, is Saskatchewan going to do that when it has cheap natural gas, either imported from Alberta or increasing more of its own natural gas, when it can build a combined cycle turbine of a similar capacity for, $400 million. But then, I was corrected. Apparently, the next era CEO is saying, no, the cost of these combined cycle gas turbines has tripled now. Right.
Yeah. So I want to touch on a
And I
couple
just
of
want
those
to just quick follow up on that, then, if I may.
Sure.
So Chris, you'll know there's this recent report. It was cited by Blacklock's. It's the Market Snapshot, Canada's Role in Small Modular Technology. And it says early estimates suggest, and we've talked about this a little bit, that capital cost per unit of production capacity for a modular reactor unit built for mining operations, for example, could be around 70% higher than traditional large reactors. And of course, as we've all pointed out, I mean, this is new technology. No country has yet produced a commercially viable modular reactor. So, and I think you've answered the question to a certain extent, but I mean, are the costs just too high, given the fact that all these numbers, as you just said, have been going up?
That is going to be an interesting question for the ratepayers and taxpayers of Saskatchewan to answer. And again, what is the best value proposition here? Does it involve upgrading the grid, strengthening interties, getting a larger thermal generator in there to be able to handle that contingency, or paying a price premium? As I was saying, when I was saying, listen, if Saskatchewan can build a gas generator for 300 megawatt size for $400 or $500 million. It seems to me that, especially with the clean electricity regulations, the foot being off the gas pedal in terms of the feds trying to control your power system, that you're going to go with what's more economic and in the best economic interests of Saskatchewan. But I have to say, we're now looking at 1.2, 1.3 billion for a 300 megawatt gas turbine in Saskatchewan. Then you have the price of the fuel. It depends, the economics, how you price in discount rates and things like that, what we think the price of gas will be 20, 30 years from now. The thing about nuclear, again, is it's a high upfront capital cost that produces wealth over generations, because it's an asset that's going to go 60, 70, 80 years maybe. And eventually, once paid off, produces really low power. But again, the question is, can you pay that big upfront cost? And with SMRs, it's going to be higher than a large unit.
Isn't the fuel for nuclear actually very cheap compared to the capital cost up front?
100%. Well, I'll give you a proviso on that, but yes, absolutely. That's a big part of it. The percentage of fuel cost in terms of the operating expense of a nuclear reactor is something like 10 or 15%. It's really, really low. Obviously, the cost of a natural gas generator, it's OpEx. The CapEx is there in the front end, but that's the main cost driver.
So
now,
if I can just interrupt you there for a second, because I want to address some of the numbers you're talking about. So Saskatchewan is currently building our third SaskPower owned large combined cycle natural gas plant. 2019, one at Swift Current called Chinook went online, cost $605 million. In December of 24, the second one went online at Moose Jaw. It cost $825 million. That was a 30
for 300 megawatt size, or what size?
370.
Gotcha. Okay.
And that was an escalation of 36% over 5 years. The one under construction now is 1.7 billion.
Wow.
For the third clone. It's over 100% escalation from the one that was just completed 8 months ago. So we are looking at the numbers for natural gas plants being higher than that low price for SMRs.
Right.
1.3 you mentioned before, and I've heard numbers in the 1 megawatt range for SMRs. Right. And natural gas is no longer cheap to build. And that was a big reason why Saskatchewan is now looking to rebuild its coal fleet, because the coal fleet's already paid for. We just got to do some maintenance, fix it up, and we can get it for another 10, 20 years as a bridge to nuclear. The Minister for SaskPower will be in Estevan today for the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers having a barbecue, saying, hey, thank God we're keeping coal for a few more years to keep the lights on. And you touched on the price for natural gas. If you look at the AECO futures market, the price of natural gas is expected to basically double over the next 4 years. Yeah. So, and Saskatchewan, we don't drill for natural gas anymore. We haven't drilled for more than 10 wells in the last 10 years. And Alberta did that by noon today. Right. So 92% of the gas we're getting is coming from Alberta. And I've done some calculations. If we were to replace our coal fleet of natural gas, and if the price going up, we could end up spending anywhere from $1 to $3 billion a year sending money to Alberta for natural gas. That if we'd shut down our coal fleet. So, the fuel cost, and people think, Saskatchewan uranium makes a lot of money. If you look at the royalties, and Brahman, you can speak to this, they're only measured in a few $100 million a year. Like, it's not much when it comes to royalties. The fuel is actually quite cheap. And can you talk a little bit about fuel processing in in Ontario, and how that would apply to Saskatchewan?
Sure. Yeah. So just to sort of reflect on what you just said there, I think what's important here is this sort of sober analysis, leaving aside the trade association hype, leaving aside that number of we can build a small modular reactor, 300 megawatts for $1 billion. That's been proven to be hogwash, right? So I think we're having a mature conversation here, a facts-informed conversation. Thank God OPG has put out, I think, a very responsible cost estimate. They're not trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. I think they priced in a lot of contingency. But again, we're looking at $6.1 billion for that first of a kind unit. And that is likely the cost that Saskatchewan would pay. The learning rates that we see in nuclear happen on a single site. Typically, when you try and build that reactor at a new site, cost goes back up again, and you may get that learning down on a multi-unit site. So in terms of fuel, I mean, so we have really the richest, highest ore grade uranium deposits in the Athabascan Basin in the world, bar none. We have average ore grades which make the rest of the world drool, where they're down below 0.1% is good for them, and we have pockets that are 20%. It's really an incredible resource that we have. Right now, that fuel is obviously dug up in the Athabascan Basin using hydropower. It's milled and refined. It is sent over to 2 Ontario sites where it's turned into pellets and then manufactured into fuel bundles. Port Hope, I believe, Blind River, and then manufactured into fuel bundles in Cambridge, Ontario, and Peterborough. So again, that value add in terms of the fuel manufacturer stays in country. And then those fuel bundles are put into CANDU reactors in Ontario and New Brunswick. Used to have some reactors in Quebec. There's no conversion or deconversion. That's when you take, chemically fascinating. You take this solid, the heaviest naturally occurring element on the periodic table, you turn it into a gas, uranium hexafluoride, and that's to put it into centrifuges to spin it and concentrate the fissile component, the uranium-235. That's what's needed for enriched fuel reactors like the American style AP1000 or the BWRX. So that's a whole other thing that we don't do in Canada. We do some gasification, essentially, this conversion, deconversion stuff, but the enrichment all happens abroad in the US, in Europe, etc. And actually, reactors that are using enriched fuel in the US, 1/3 of the fuel is actually from Russia because there's insufficient enrichment capacity. So we get to bypass all of that.
Canada? I mean, can we, by treaty, because of all sorts of stuff, we just bombed Iran, or the Americans did, can we scale up enrichment facilities in Canada and actually be allowed to do that? I've heard, and I don't know if it's true or not, the treaties won't even allow us to do high enrichment for these reactors.
There have been attempts in the past, and the US has quashed those. Is it possible physically? Absolutely. Is it possible politically? These become complicated questions. I don't believe there's any single treaty or piece of legislation or law that says Canada is forbidden from doing so. We haven't signed a 1, 2, 3 agreement with the US, as most countries that have imported US reactors have done, which says, hey, we promise not to enrich uranium. Because we had CANDU, we didn't have to suffer the indignity of having to sign any of these kinds of agreements. That being said, it's a pretty massive investment. Having spoke with Cameco folks a few years ago anyway, they said, listen, we have no interest in building enrichment in Canada. We have the resource, the US doesn't. They have, the enrichment, they have the regulations in place, they have some facilities in place. We'll do it down there. I have heard some talk now, and I think this is part of Westinghouse's sale pitch to try and get past that advantage CANDU has of total fuel sovereignty, total fuel security, no exposure to, the enrichment market and that squeeze right now, which is really driving up prices. And I think it's probably just to try and make the AP1000 more digestible in Canada by saying, hey, yeah, we could maybe do enrichment in Canada. I think it's unlikely to happen. If we do end up building a few nuclear units, that's really insufficient, demand to justify that investment, which is going to be many, many billions of dollars, and a whole lot of licensing headache. And frankly, the countries that enrich kind of like having a bit of a monopoly on that. So, we'll see what happens there. But right now, our strength is really having the world's richest uranium ores, and I think our national strength is having a 100% energy security play here in terms of our fuel, which is completely in the Canadian ecosphere, and again, where all that value add happens and occurs here in Canada.
Just on the enrichment issue, Chris, so the Canada Energy Regulator has cautioned that small reactors produce relatively high nuclear waste amounts per unit of energy. They require enriched uranium as opposed to natural uranium used in CANDU reactors. I had written down in New Brunswick and Ontario, for example, and as a result of this caution, which was cited in that earlier piece I referenced, we would have to rely on foreign suppliers for uranium enrichment, it was pointed out. So comments on all of that? I mean, I think that that's not, again, completely understood out there, the degree to which there will be this enrichment component. And I remember when I was minister having a conversation with someone who shall remain nameless about in the sector, saying people really haven't figured that out, and I'm not sure they'll be so thrilled about it when they do. So thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so two questions there. I think one is around amount of waste produced, and the other is this issue of enrichment and constraints. So I mean, in terms of the waste, I've toured the large waste facilities here in Canada, right, which are interim storage sites. So basically, a Costco warehouse full of these large concrete and steel casks that contain the freshly spent waste. Once it's cooled off for a few years in a very, very deep swimming pool, it's placed into these dry casks, which will last hundreds of years. You walk around with a dosimeter, and I'm a nerd who carries a dosimeter a lot of places I go, and you're getting a dose less than being in an airplane, right? And it just sits there in a Costco-sized warehouse building. You can put it outdoors, but we like to go above and beyond, so we put it in a kind of Costco-sized warehouse. The waste volume thing, like a lot is made out of that. It's such an incredibly, the E equals MC squared phenomenology, right? Converting mass into energy. It's extraordinarily efficient in terms of the amount of waste produced. Nuclear waste is really the ideal form of waste. It's not coal ash. You don't have to build slurry ponds. It's not, going off into the air as particulate or CO2. It is solid, ultra dense, and very manageable. Does it take a lot of skill to handle and manage? Absolutely. Has anyone ever been injured from storing and managing expensive alien waste? No, which is absolutely incredible. This stuff is hazardous. It is dangerous, but we make dangerous things safe. And we've done that. We've proven it. And, if a bunch of dry casts are sitting in a Costco-sized warehouse for a few hundred years, getting safer and safer and safer and less radioactive, I think that's a real benefit. And so I'm not really worried about, this SMR, because it's a little smaller, it's going to be a little less efficient in terms of its fuels and produce a little more waste. We're talking about really insignificant volumes here. And, there's far greater waste problems to stay up late at night worrying about. In terms of,
we just have to interrupt you here, Chris, because we have to do one more ad, and we are rapidly running out of time. Some people have asked for taking comments, but I think we're going to be short for time for that. I do want to get into the eVinci before we leave here. So let's go to ad for 30 seconds. There's a reason the HG Jack has dominated Saskatchewan's oil patch. That's because that distinctive curved walking beam reduces energy consumption by about 25%. That means 25% less power bills, 25% less carbon tax. That's a big difference. And it's available exclusively from Grimes Sales and Service, Batman, Saskatchewan. So, Chris, I want to get into here because this is an important part of it. We've talked about large reactors, and there's really three scales. We have the large reactor, which are 600 to 1,000 megawatts. We have the small reactors, which, if you consider Shan Power Station small, it's not small. It's a misnomer. They never should have used that term. And then we have what truly are small reactors, which are now called micro reactors, which are 5 to 100 megawatt, but more like 5 to 20 megawatt. Saskatchewan Research Council has signed on to build the first Westinghouse eVinci reactor, which is 5 to 10 megawatt scale. And you wrote an op-ed, which I published on Pipeline Online the other day, being pretty harsh about that. So what are your thoughts on the small scale micro reactors?
This is the issue with nuclear energy. There's a lot of really compelling narratives. And when we're faced with what we consider to be sort of existential questions around climate change, et cetera, sometimes we get a little delusional and fantastical in terms of our thinking. We see that a lot in the fusion space, but within the fission space, you've probably, if you're paying any attention, noticed tons of companies popping up in the microreactor space. There's supposed to be the first criticality of one by July 4th, 2026, that Trump just announced. But in any case, yeah, the eVinci is a 5 megawatt reactor that has great promise, really. If you look at the issues facing northern communities, where they have really high costs of heating oil and diesel. If you look at remote mining sites, if you can have a so-called nuclear battery or a swap-in for a diesel generator that doesn't produce any particulate and doesn't have a high, fuel cost, it sounds great on paper. You see these animations of a truck pulling up on site, dropping off this reactor, onto a pad, clicks together like Lego, zippity doop. You've got 8 years of maintenance-free, carbon-free, reliable power. When something sounds too good to be true, it generally is. And so there's a few issues here. One is that the promises, especially with new first-of-a-kind technology, they take a while to be ironed out. They are notably going to be building a smaller version without a power conversion system of this reactor at Idaho National Labs and sort of making sure their heat pipe system works. That's going to take a number of years. But the big issue here is radiation, right? And I'm not a radiation phobic, shall we say. It can be managed very, very effectively, and it's best managed in large centralized sites with dedicated infrastructure and teams. And that's again why we have that perfect safety record in terms of storing spent nuclear fuel. Yes, you can drive this thing up to a site and deliver it. Once it becomes radioactive, that's a whole other story, right? And what you're not seeing in that nice little mock-up is the amount of shielding around one of these reactors. You need about 5 feet of concrete to block the intense radiation that comes off even a small reactor. Here's a fancy little history fact. The second controlled chain reaction as part of the Manhattan Project is a bunch of graphite blocks with uranium in it. It produced 2 kilowatts of power, so it could power 2 toaster ovens. It gave off a dose of, forget about the units, or 300 millisieverts an hour, but basically, per second. That basically means you get a fatal dose in about 17 or 18 seconds standing next to the thing unshielded. So a reactor producing 2 toaster ovens worth of electricity needed 5 feet of concrete around it, right? So things are going to look a little more complicated in terms of the site, but then when you need to pick this thing up and drive it back, it becomes a major logistical problem.
Well, and every model that I've seen of this, they're not showing big containment things. And let's just,
no, you don't see the shielding. Yeah.
No, and like, let me see if I have a containment image here. So I mean, these buildings here, you can't really tell. This is the Bruce thing. Yeah. There's big, heavy cement ones here. Everyone thinks that these towers is the reactor. No, that's cooling towers.
Yeah.
You can see in this one here, if you look at the tube on the left-hand side, that is the containment for a 300 megawatt. Right. And, as you said, whether it's 5 megawatt or 300 or 1,000, you still need 5 feet of containment. Yep. And none of the stuff I've seen for the micro reactors has talked about containment the way you're talking right now.
Absolutely. So that's just, when you're operating it, but when you need to go and back your truck up and put it back on board, if there's no shielding there, your truck driver's dead in, seconds to minutes, right? And so you need a shielding cast. And we do this all the time. Like if we move highly radioactive substances, and people are always thinking it's, nuclear waste from power plants, it's usually actually spent radioisotopes from hospitals, highly, highly radioactive as well. We know how to manage these. We put them in, lead-lined steel containers, and we move them all the time, right? But these are compact little volumes that we move around. When you're talking about moving this eVinci core, which the specifications are not so available, we're talking sort of 2 by 3 meters, the kind of cask that would need to go into to both shield it. And then again, we're talking nuclear, right? If we're going to move this thing, we go above and beyond. We need to, light it on fire for a whole day and see if it cracks. We need to drop it from 9 meters. We need to submerge it in water. We need to, crash a plane into it. So, then you need to move this thing from where it's been sited remotely all the way back to some centralized facility to defuel it inside of a hot cell. So again, 5 feet of concrete, lead-lined windows, robotic arms, defueling. This becomes logistically a mega nightmare. And there's a chicken and egg thing. Like it might work if you deployed hundreds and hundreds of these things, which would then justify the investment in a dedicated workforce that would go and pick these things up, move them back, I don't know, to Pittsburgh, get clearances from Transport Canada. CNSC, the Canadian Nuclear Regulator, if we're going across the border, lots of opportunities for communities to go like, hey, you're not driving this through my community. It's messy. So again, economies of scale. Nuclear works really well in these large central stations.
Yeah.
All the infrastructure there and a dedicated workforce. And again, moving things over short distances, from the reactor, 100 feet to the big swimming pool, another 200 feet to the Costco warehouse, that's easy, right? But when you atomize this, when you cut it up into 1,000 parts and put them all over God's green earth in remote mining sites and remote communities, this really just falls apart. And it's kind of a first principles thing. And, I'm kind of surprised because, I don't think other people aren't aware of this when you start thinking through the logistical stuff, but there's so much excitement about nuclear. The narrative's there, the stock market bubble is there. I think it's ultimately very damaging for the nuclear sector in the end, because in 5 to 10 years, I think there's going to be a lot of disappointment. The Saskatchewan Research Council's put up $70 million for this, like from the perspective of like cool technology, R&D, training up engineers, talent, sure. But it's kind of like fusion. You're not getting a consumer product in the end. I think I'll have to come back for another show, but there are SMRs that are being deployed in Russia. There's a floating nuclear power station along the Northern Sea Route, which is going to be used to power mining operations. That's a whole other thing. We're talking, Russia, 70 years of running nuclear icebreakers, dedicated facilities to refuel these icebreakers, which can apply to their floating small modular reactors. Westinghouse doesn't have that. Canada doesn't have it. And then it was one last thing, Brian, you mentioned, one of the big strengths of nuclear and why the operating expenses are so cheap is because fuel is cheap. Well, the eVinci microreactor uses a special kind of fuel. It's enriched up, CANDU's zero enrichment. The American reactor is 5%. You're looking at a piece of triso fuel here, which is 20% enriched and then, encapsulated in a highly complex fuel element with silicon carbide, et cetera. And the cost of this fuel, just to give you a sense, CANDU fuel all in fabricated about $500 per kilogram. The American reactor fuel, about $1,500, $2,000 per kilogram. This stuff costs $30,000 per kilogram. And because you're paying that price all up front, unlike diesel, which is expensive and a pain in the ass to move into these remote sites, this becomes part of your CapEx because you're having to pay for it upfront, all that fuel for 8 years. And so even just the fuel itself starts to make these things a very, very tricky economic prospect. But I think it's really the back-end logistics, managing that highly radioactive core. You can't just put it back on the truck and drive it to some nice facility. This is highly regulated and dangerous and difficult work. Again, we make dangerous things safe. Getting on a ladder is probably the most dangerous thing you'll do. Getting on an airplane, flying at 30,000 feet in a pressurized compartment, with thousands of, mission critical moving parts, air traffic control, that's the safest way to travel in the world. Well, nuclear is the safest way to make electricity, despite there being dangers of radiation, because we know how to manage those and we do it in a really controlled environment in large centralized nuclear power stations. I hate to say it, but I think that's where the economic case for nuclear comes. I just don't think it scales down. I think economies of scale, unlike a diesel generator, can go from a few kilowatts up to close to 100 megawatts and big marine diesel engines. You just don't see that scaling happening with nuclear, in my opinion.
Gosh, in the interest of time, Chris, would you mind? And I know there have been experiments in the SMR sphere in the U.S. Could you just run through, if you could, kind of a compare and contrast with the prototypes that have been deployed in the U.S., how they've gone? And I know one has been slightly more economic than the other, or was, and I don't know exactly where those are at, but I think it would kind of help listeners in terms of what's actually, and you mentioned Russia, but what's actually been undertaken or attempted to be undertaken in the US, and what models were those and what happened to them from a prototypes perspective, and then, and cost perspective. And then just from a really sort of 40,000 foot view, what the main prototypes are out there at the moment, and really briefly, like what the flaws are with them, and then kind of coming back to your CANDU point. I mean, I noted that in terms of the Fed subsidies to date, there's been 27 million and counting. That's just for the Westinghouse Electric prototype. So sort of high level view of what the prototypes are and what's been undertaken and tried in the US and what happened.
Yeah, I mean, so basically the history of nuclear power, the entire commercial fleet around the world, with the exception of Russia, it does a sodium fast reactor technology. It doesn't compete. It's way more expensive than their water cooled technologies. But around the world, the only commercially viable nuclear reactors are water-cooled reactors. There's been some use of gas as a coolant, and those are rapidly coming offline in Britain. So what's really emerged is water-moderated, water-cooled reactors in the form of basically US and Canadian technologies. In the US, it's this light water reactor that uses enriched fuel. In Canada and the nations we've exported to, like China, Korea, Romania, Argentina, heavy water. And we have 200 years, basically, since the Industrial Revolution, experience managing pressure vessels and steam as a working fluid. And all of that has gone into why this has worked well in nuclear. And there's a variety of other reasons why, again, these water-moderated reactors work well. We have definitely experimented with lots of exotic concept, molten salt reactors, again, these sodium-cooled reactors, high-temperature gas reactors. It's not that they weren't tried, right? And these are what we now call Gen 4. I call them Gen 0 because rather than being advanced reactors, they failed to advance. And they failed to advance not because of grand conspiracies, but because they're just a lot harder to engineer. Working with, helium as a working fluid, which is, next to hydrogen, extraordinarily leaky, difficult to troubleshoot. Molten salts, very, very exotic chemistry, highly corrosive environments. There's a reason why these reactors haven't developed. The Chinese are sort of in the lead in terms of, brute forcing and seeing where they can go with them. But for all intents and purposes, what has worked and what has been viable and what continues to be are these, traditional moderated, water moderated reactors. And they are now, have passive safety worked into them, a lot of sort of walk away safe things where just the physics of how the reactors work make them incredibly safe. In terms of
Admiral Hyman Rickover, who is the godfather or the grandfather of the nuclear navy of the United States. I don't remember the exact quote was, but if you look it up, he had a very good description of what happens with these experimental reactors. And they just never seem to work out. We're rapidly running out of time here. We did have an announcement yesterday from the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, that she's convened a working group or committee or whatever you want to call it to start looking into nuclear. And she's now, our Saudi Arabia is now talking about nuclear as the new frontier. So can you briefly talk about what Alberta may be doing here?
Well, Saudi Arabia is also actively pursuing nuclear as well. So, yes, I mean, there's been big interest in Alberta going back some time. I think they're looking to diversify. 75% of their generation is now natural gas. They've got a lot of natural gas for now, but that's they've also built out a lot of renewables, as we saw in the cold snap of January 2023. All that stuff just disappeared when it was needed most. So nuclear can provide that reliable backbone. I think in this moment of nation building, we're hearing federally, there's huge opportunities here. And a big one is, building large units in Alberta where there's greater contingency to handle that N+1 criteria. Exciting project up in the Peace River area for large CANDU units. I think this makes a lot of sense. And again, tying in the feds into some funding there, BC is power hungry. They are suffering droughts. They're importing more power than they ever have. They're going to build wind and solar despite having some of the worst wind and solar resources in the country, mountains blocking winds and frankly, not a lot of sun. That's supposed to spare the reservoirs a bit, but it doesn't make their peak capacity any higher if those things don't show up when they need it most, which is typically when renewables, frankly, go absent without leave. And so if BC is too hoity...
In the last week, Alberta's wind generation has fallen to
disappeared.
0.1%, 1%. Yesterday, 1.3%. Right now, it's 5%.
Right. So if British Columbia is too good for nuclear and has a ban in place, I think they can do just like the Germans are, buy from nuclear-powered France. If Alberta builds some spare nuclear capacity, Site C, WC Bennett, big hydroelectric infrastructures. We've got an intertie right now just across to Cranbrook in southern Alberta. If you could strengthen an intertie in Alberta between the Peace River region, Site C, WC Bennett, and run that power up into northeastern, northwestern BC, power some of that LNG infrastructure, get it lower carbon. That's going to help potentially marketing it abroad. I think this is a real exciting nation building exercise potential in this region. Is it going to take investment? Yes. Should the feds get behind that and line it up? I think 100%. And I think that's how you, again, build economy of scale nuclear, which is, I think, the only nuclear that really makes sense. You build these gigawatt scale units. And I think there's a good, strong economic case and a nation building case up there. So that's kind of my pitch to the Alberta folks.
Parting thoughts, Bronwyn?
No, just thank you so much, Chris. Very, very helpful discussion. And as you say, very overdue, I think, in terms of factual a sense of where we're at and context. And so much appreciated. And we would love to have you back.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, Chris, this has been a fascinating discussion. Sorry, folks, we weren't able to get many questions in here because you've got to take off here pretty quick, literally. So thank you very much for your time, Chris. Anything you want to conclude with?
Oh, I mean, there's so much to add. I'd be very happy to come back for either just to kind of ask me anything with your audience or discuss more with yourselves. I'm passionate about this topic. I could go, this could be a Joe Rogan episode. We could go for 3 hours, but yeah, let's maybe break it up. Be happy to come back. And again, what's I think exciting and what Canadian Nuclear Energy and myself bring to this picture is we have no industry ties. We're not beholden to a board made up of various vendors of reactors, and I think we really pride ourselves on being very data driven. Yes, do we have certain biases? Yes, I think those are because they're in the Canadian national interest as we see it, and we are shameless economic nationalists, which I think has been proven to be a strong position as we face this new trade war with who we thought was a reliable partner. So in any case, yeah, happy to come back and chat some more. I think we scratched the surface in these areas. Again, category errors are very common in nuclear. It's a unique technology, and it really takes careful study to be informed and to make multi-billion-dollar decisions. So yeah, it's great being on, guys. I love your podcast. Production's just awesome.
Well, I have to say, folks, I've been telling people I will be writing more about the nuclear space in Saskatchewan than all the other media combined. Chris, hopefully will be start of a great relationship. And thank you very much, people.